capacity of buying of the local Filipino communities. And according to the research, a Filipino can afford to buy, we call it like 5 peso to 30 peso, that's less than a dollar, close to 5 to 10 baht. An average Filipino can buy a top load of around that amount, around 5 to 30 peso. So the telecommunication industry then was sustained because of the power of they call it the bottom of the pyramid market. And we adopted the same strategy with my current operation in the Bureau of the Muslim Economic Affairs under the Office of the President. Our primary recommendation is to really put up a budget in sustaining, number one, the trading relation of the small and medium-sized enterprise, and number two is to capacitate them. I also would like to acknowledge my neighbor in Malaysia with my different trading relation, as emphasized earlier by Dr. Miki. We actually partnered with one of the biggest microfinancing institutions. We just signed in a memorandum of understanding between the autonomous government in the Philippines as well as the Amana Ikhtiar Malaysia. And we're currently developing our experts through scholarship ventures. One from the Asian Institute of Management, financed by the Australian Aid, and two with the University of Utara Malaysia. We are creating a pool of experts on Islamic microfinance and Islamic banking and finance, which are a major need in the Philippine government. And third is also to support our local market. Fourth, we need to integrate the resource mobilization coming from the private sector specifically. When I joined the Philippine government, my colleague would always say, like what Dr. Houston mentioned earlier, there's always a deficiency and deficit in the budget. But in my experience coming from the private sector, I really don't see it as a matter of a concern because I already have my private partners. I'm glad to say that most of my funding requirements actually come from the private sector. And when we see, I'd like to go back to my emphasis earlier, the collaboration of the different agency in the Philippine scenery, which is not just acknowledging the role of the government, but more so with the private sector and the civil society. So what I did in all the projects that I worked with addressing sustainable development, what I did is I do a mapping of my resources. How much budget do I get from my bureau? And out of this, I also do a mapping of the needs that I would like to put in my budget. So there I came in, I had to call my colleagues from the private sector, from the banking industry to address this concern. But again, this is a small office under the President's office. We have a lot of challenges being encountered. And in support to the different strategy that we are doing with the ASEAN network, the Philippine government have started crafting the Philippine Strategy for Sustainable Development starting in 1992. And with the more recent one, we have an expanded enhanced Philippine agenda for 2021, but our recommendation had sparked not only addressing economic development with the other areas, including poverty reduction, social equity, empowerment and good governance, and the most important, which is very salient in some of the economies in Southeast Asia, which is peace and security. So with this, we would like to strengthen our ties as far as the Philippine government is concerned. And on behalf of our President, His Excellency President Benigno Simeon Aquino III, when we can stand up with a transparent government, there is no difficulty in inviting participation and collaboration with the private sector. And we can top the collaboration with the civil society and the private sector, then it would be easy to address the issue on the insufficiency of funding requirement with each government. Thank you very much and good afternoon.
Thank you very much for raising the issues on the funding and the banking sector and the role of the private sector, in particular on the SME with the government. Yes, Hasri?
Thank you, Dean Chaidong. Good afternoon, everyone. I will just start by congratulating Professor Easton Phua for that comprehensive tour de force of economic approach to sustainable development. But some of you may have watched an old movie by the famous Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa called Rashomon, where one murder is witnessed by 4 witnesses. And just not only, it's the same with sustainable development. We need more than economic analysis to understand and to move towards sustainable development solutions. One of the biggest problems with sustainable development is measurement. How do we measure the success of sustainable development? Environmental Performance Index developed by Yale and Columbia University have been widely used by governments and media to assess environmental performance across countries in the world. In the 2012 Environmental Performance Index, none of the ASEAN member states are categorized as top-notch performers. And luckily, none are categorized as the weakest performers as well. Malaysia, Brunei, Thailand, and Philippines are all bracketed under the strong performers, yeah, with Malaysia on top. I'm going to say a bit more about that. And Singapore, sorry, Professor Istinkwa, Singapore, Myanmar, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Vietnam are categorized as modest performer. But even if you look at the case of Malaysia, where it is, ranked as the top in ASEAN member state, if you look at the sector-based analysis, Climate Performance Index put Malaysia in bottom rank together with USA, Canada, and Saudi Arabia. On biodiversity measurement, Malaysia is ranked third worst countries when it comes to threatened species. Yeah? So that is in contradiction with the Environmental Performance Index. When it was announced that Malaysia is ranked number 25th, I was invited on national TV to prime time to deliberate why we have managed to do so well only after 2 years. Because in 2010, Malaysia was ranked 56. So in 2 years, from 56 jumped to 25th. Of course, I spoiled the party by saying that it was a change in methodology. The other thing is, Malaysia has done awful a lot, I mean, to be fair to the country, but environmental reforms have been outstripped by the scale of environmental problems. In 2012 alone, there were at least 10 front-page exclusive coverage of environmental degradation of environmentally sensitive areas in 2012 alone. And there's also increasing cases of water supply disruption in major cities. So, despite of the measurement that says all is well in Malaysia, the devil is in the detail. And 10 years ago, civil society aptly summarized that when it comes to policy making, the words are in the right place, but the actions are not. So how do you move forward from there? How do we tackle the 4 obstacles to achieving sustainable development in Malaysia? One is the federal structure governance challenge in Malaysia. Second is the general apathy among public about environmental issues and the need to address environmental issues. And third, like Professor Istinkwa mentioned again and again, resources are underpriced, be they energy, water, and other natural resources as well, water. And then when it comes to governance, there's also a problem with implementation. Government agencies work in silos. How do you address this? So the way forward, I think, is for Malaysia, and I suspect it's true for other countries as well, is to think institutionally and act institutionally, meaning that we have to complement bottom-up and top-down approach with a network perspective on polycentric governance. Yeah? I mean, governance has got to happen at various levels. And in Malaysia now, we're talking about 4 approaches to reforming environmental governance. First is to redesign agencies. For instance, maybe we put Department of Environment under Prime Minister's Department. So change its function from a implementation agency to a planning agency. And number 2 is to reshape environmental advocacy. NIMBY syndrome is not always negative. It's also a reflection of the growth or development of environmental consciousness on the part of civil society. The Linus case that Professor Kwah mentioned just now is unprecedented in the history of Malaysia, where you have over 20,000 people marching on the street for the cause of Linus. And the next step perhaps is for the civil society to graduate into a political representation in the parliament, to have a group of people, a group of members of parliament with environmental interest. Of course, the ideal is to have green party like some countries. The third approach is to acknowledge the fact that conservation needs financing. Conservation is not free. So there are now talks about establishing natural resource fund in Malaysia so that we can circumvent the problem of state and federal constraint when it comes to environmental management. And we also have to perhaps deal with payment for ecosystem services because of the federal structure in Malaysia. State government that are dependent on the other state government for its water services have got to pay the other state government, for instance, or other region for the services that it provide to the state. And I would like to end with a positive note saying that since 2009, there is a move to embrace green technology or green growth in Malaysia. Green technology policy was launched in 2009. The green technology portfolio was introduced in the Water and Energy Ministry. And there's also a green technology fund to encourage industries to move toward green technology. We need to do more and more, but the most important thing, I will conclude by saying that we have to build on the interconnections. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. History introduced about the Environmental Performance Index for the ASEAN members and also some of the statistical information. He also mentioned about the example of Malaysia, in particular for the green technology and green growth and also the green technology funding. He also mentioned about, the funding that this is need for the environmental conservation. I think we sort of putting all the jigsaws together, starting from novel about the social development, social sustainability, and then income inequality, and trade and financing, and also on the environmental performance index. Now, we have the next expert on the energy. We have Luki Lontos, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much for the Chulalongkorn University and also for Dr. Mia Mikic for introducing our institutions in this event. My name is Luki Lonto and I am from Indonesia. So for Professor Easton, I feel sorry for your cough right now. So, and I'm sorry for the haze on behalf of Indonesian people. So, the presentations from Professor Kwa pretty much cover everything that I have to, I can imagine in the sustainable development and the fossil fuel energy, but I think I will try to focus my presentations on the fuel subsidy issues and why this thing is really matter in the sustainable development debate right now. Just to give you an example of the magnitude of this fossil fuel subsidy matters in the sustainable development. Just now, the government of Indonesia decided that it will disburse or provide like 10 million US dollar in tackling the haze problem in Sumatra right now. 10 million US dollar. You know, our fuel subsidy right now, it stands like 1,000% bigger than the fund that we allocated for this haze problem. In other way, if Indonesia don't use its fiscal strength to fully allocate it into the fuel subsidy, we can have this kind of program to tackle the haze problem, perhaps for tens of years, and even the even Brunei Darussalam also, if they are using their fuel subsidy, they can have more contributions perhaps in tackling this haze problem. So that just the demonstration on how big is the magnitude of fuel subsidy in in sustainable development issues. The IEA estimates that there could be 400 to 500 billion US dollar right now is spending your money. This is public money that is spending to subsidize fuel. In other terms, we are subsidizing people to create pollutions because fossil fuel, this is one of the main sources of the greenhouse gas emission right now. And in terms of the regional development, unfortunately, the ASEAN 5 is among the all the countries which is included in the ASEAN 5 is one of the biggest contributors of this fossil fuel subsidies. What really matters with these fossil fuel subsidies? First is one of the biggest myth or misunderstanding about the reform in fossil fuel subsidy is normally that most of the people think that this initiative will try to remove all the fuel subsidy from a country. It is actually not entirely accurate because the initiative in looking or evaluate the fuel subsidy policy is actually is trying to figure out whether this kind of incentive can be justified rationally and can be tested whether they can meet the goal, the development goal, its own goal, and also the goals of the sustainable development. So that's the thing that we have to bear in mind. The second is this method that is implemented by some of our ASEAN member countries, we can argue that there is a flaw in this mechanism and it costs us billions of dollars. Especially with the recent development, we can think that the fossil fuel subsidy at some extent circumscribe or limit our government capacity, fiscal capacity, to provide support for infrastructures development. So these things relate to the explanation from Professor Kwa that there is a trade-off. And also the second thing is most of the ASEAN member countries right now is on the trend to become energy importer countries. We have to be careful with this because this system or our dependency with the fossil fuel that is generated by years of incentive to use the fossil fuel, and it will expose our countries to the price volatility or in sustainable development concept to the uncertainty. Based on the uncertainty at the global economy, from the climate change, and also from the political twist that we normally have every while and then. So I think that's the importance of a fossil fuel subsidy in the sustainable development. What the ISD and GSI doing is to help people to share the information from each of ASEAN member countries. We held an ASEAN Policymakers Forum in Bali last year. It has been done quite successfully. We have several informations and enhanced information network in Southeast Asia, and we are trying to compile success stories and also a failed story from other parts in the world, every part in the world, and we try to distribute it, this to the people who is, or governments especially, who are in the course to reform its fuel subsidy policy or energy policy. And in this scheme, you don't have to agree with this, but we develop a scheme that there will be three main pillars. First is we need to get the prices right. But to get this price right, you have to first back it up with the precise and deep analysis or background research to make it good. And the second is you have also to think about building support for reform, communicating the goal, the reason of this policy to the people. This will be helpful because we also learn that there are several setbacks in countries who have successfully reformed their energy policy but have to get back to redistribute the subsidy. So this public support will be very, very important to maintain the progress that a government or a country have done. And the second is you have to manage the impact of the reform, because this is not only to save money and to reallocate our fiscal strength to another more sustainable development programs, but also we realize that there are perhaps some social sectors that could be or that could have a severe impact during these transitions, and that is our obligation to also include them within this scheme. And last but not least, the reform would be hard. It will meet the public resistance in most of the case, but it is possible. That's the most important thing, and not because of this concept is good, but from the examples of ASEAN member countries, you have did it. Philippines did it in liberalized their oil price in 1998. Vietnam have done an extensive work to boost their electrifications for tens of years. Indonesia have just done it before. I don't think there is a problem with Singapore. The problem would be for you in Malaysia. So welcome to the club. So I think I finished my presentation now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. While you're talking, I'm searching for more information. Well, eliminating the subsidies in Indonesia, then the gas price went up by 44%. Diesel's price went up by 22%. And the amount of subsidy roughly cost about $30 billion US.
Yes.
And as a result, the expectation on the inflation, it will go up from about 4.7 to 7.2% by the end of the year. That's the result of the removing of the subsidies. Thailand is also follow the footstep because we are reducing the subsidy on the natural gas. So price of the natural gas will go up on the monthly basis until it reaches to the market price. But of course, we are linking the subsidies to the environmental issues such as air pollution, because you mentioned about the fossil fuel subsidies and the use of fossil fuel and the result on the air pollution. Last but not least, we do have Kun Thanat from ICES of Singapore. Yes, please.
Hello, okay. Thank you very much, Ajahn Chayodom and Dr. Mia Mingich, for this opportunity to be here today. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Seeing as I am the last discussant, and I'm the only thing standing in between the way of our discussions later and the massive backlog of traffic that's going to occur due to the long weekend, I'm going to try to keep everything nice and concise. So everyone has mentioned a little bit of something that I'm going to be talking about today, so I'd like to discuss a little bit more about an underlying issue that isn't really brought up to the forefront, and that is about political will. Now, with political will in ASEAN, as a bloc with 10 member nations, sovereignty is always going to be an issue. It's a sensitive issue. But in aiming towards a tighter integrated region, this is something that we're all going to have to overcome. And as you'll see in some of the examples below, we're just in the process of doing that. The first thing I'd like to touch upon about is the haze, with all due respect to my Indonesian counterpart here. And according to Professor Kwa's presentation, the haze can cause massive economic damage. I believe in his slides in 1997, the monetary figure for that value came out to about $1.4 billion. ASEAN actually has an agreement on transboundary haze, and it's designed to prevent and monitor the haze through capacity building measures. It's been in effect since 2003 and has been signed by all of the ASEAN members and has been ratified by everyone except for Indonesia. Currently, I believe that Indonesia has submitted this agreement to the current legislature, but there's no prediction about when it will be ratified. ASEAN has consensus-oriented mechanisms, and while that is appropriate for the diplomatic nature of Asia in general, it may sometimes prove hard to find pragmatic solutions, and also provides little to no scope of accountability or enforceability. Now, bilateral cooperation is one of the options, but as Professor Kwa mentioned earlier, we can even have trilateral cooperation or international agencies. Pretty much all the stakeholders come in to try to solve this problem. Once again, I feel that sovereignty is going to be an issue here. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is green tech and infrastructure. I'm a little new to this, so please correct me if I'm wrong. We have many experts here. Green tech is vital to green growth. However, I feel that government subsidies on these technologies is not a sustainable form, and it's only good for the short run. Now, I feel that some issues about some of these renewable sources deal with intermittence. For example, if you're going to look at solar and wind power, these forms of energy they're far more powerful enough to generate power, but the issue lies in intermittence. The sun will not always shine at the strength that you want it to due to cloud cover, and the wind will not always blow at the necessary pace at which is required. So I feel that this is one of the reasons why fossil fuels are still being used today, because one, they're cheaper, and two, they're a very consistent source of energy. So I think that there needs to be more R&D done and possibly a sustainable financing framework in order to help improve the scalability of these projects so that you can entice investors to come and invest. And so governments, I think, need to provide initiatives and incentives to make these renewable sources of energy sustainable. Next thing I want to talk about is physical infrastructure. Now, physical infrastructure is critical for economic growth, It provides, in short, it provides a better investment climate as well as building up resilience in ASEAN for unexpected various external shocks. Now, the problem with this is that infrastructure is very, very expensive. According to estimates by the ADB, we are looking at ASEAN's needs for infrastructure in the next 10 years. You're looking at about $60 billion a year. And that's something that no government can finance. It's just impossible. While ASEAN has an infrastructure fund, the allocation of these funds is very limited, and it's only projected to fund about 5 infrastructure projects per year, with a $75 million cap for each project. You know, as I mentioned earlier, financing is an issue for both physical infrastructure and green technology. Not enough resources in the government. So what I suggest is that we should pull the private sector into this in the form of a public-private partnership. This will allow us to tackle projects that would be infeasible individually, but with the guidance of the public sector and the capital of the private sector, both sides stand to gain from this collaboration. The public sector will end up getting their infrastructure, which could eventually lead to more economic growth in the future, while the private sector stands to gain by reaping profits from otherwise infeasible sources. Next, I'd like to touch a little bit on inclusive growth in ASEAN. So, as you saw earlier in the slides, ASEAN's growth has been tremendous in the last decade, and even now is looking to outperform global growth due to uncertainty in the economic conditions. Now, at the cost, because since it's grown so rapidly, it's been a major accomplishment that poverty reduction has come, and it's been a massive amount. Now, the cost of this comes at the price of an increase in both income and non-income inequality. It may be surprising to some of you, maybe not, that Thailand is actually the highest ranking country in terms of, in Southeast Asia, in terms of unequal distribution of family income. And it's actually ranked 12th in the world where data is available. And you have Malaysia as the only country in Asia, based on figures from the Asian Development Bank, from the period of 1993 to about 2008 to 2009, they are the only country in Asia which has actually decreased inequality, as in their Gini coefficient has come down. Academic research has also shown that inequality retards growth in developing countries. And so with all this being said, economic and social policies can no longer be separated. Governments need to act, and they need to address job growth and equal opportunities for the entire population. Now, what I feel is more important is the pattern of growth. We don't want to have growth where the rich are getting rich much more quickly than the poor are. One obvious way to tackle this is to generate employment opportunities for the poor, and this will hopefully mitigate the stability problems, both socially and politically, that come with unemployment. Such ways that governments could do this could come through educational policies and social safety nets. So for educational policies, we could have vocational education and training systems. And social safety nets can encompass pensions and welfare schemes. I'd like to wrap back a little bit and talk about some climate change and their effects on the poor. Now, the poor are more affected, they're more severely affected than other groups due to their dependence on natural resources and climate-sensitive sectors such as fisheries and agriculture. They're also very limited in their ability to cope financially and institutionally with climate variability. Now, as mentioned earlier, the two methods to tackle this are adaptation and mitigation. And while mitigation is a short-term solution. I think adaptation should be emphasized, and to protect the implementation of, and you can do this through by implementing risk reduction policies, and tackling the sources of vulnerability for the poor. And the onus is on the government to actually push these policies through so that they can have more inclusive growth. And they also have to be wary about the endowment problem, because once you give something and if they like it, then you realize it's going to be tough to take it back. Finally, I'd like to end with a little example of how political will has driven a country to the forefront of green growth. And this country that I'm talking about is South Korea. In about 2000, maybe towards the latter half of last decade, in the late 2000s, the government recognized that there was a gap in society and environmental economics, and as such, they pushed 3 strategies forward to help facilitate green growth. And the first measure is for climate change and securing energy dependence. And the second of these pillars is the creation of new engines of growth, while the final one is to contribute to the international community. Now, I believe the government of South Korea has actually done a very, very good job because they promoted green financing to the private sector in 2010, resulting in large scales of PPP projects for their infrastructure needs. And they have also done a great job of disseminating their experiences to the international community. As I attended a conference or a seminar in 2011 where Professor Kwa was actually there, and it's been very, very insightful. So I just want to conclude by saying that with political will, if there is a will, there will be a way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Khun Thanat has brought several issues. I'm not going to repeat it, but most interesting is the example of the South Korea. Well, I'm not sure what will be your response, Houston. Actually, there's 6 discussions. You have about no more than 10 minutes. Yeah.
Well, I'll take about 1 minute. Yeah. Well, thank you all discussants for the interesting, varied comments. I think the thrust of most of your comments is to complement, to add on to the things that I say concerning the economic growth and the pursuit and the protection of the environment. So I've heard about social sustainability in addition to environmental sustainability, which of course is a very important concept, and as well as fraught with the same difficulties as one approaches environmental sustainability. But without social sustainability, we can't talk a lot about environmental sustainability, right? Because they have to follow from environmental sustainability. I've heard about international trade and politics as well. That's also important, about how it affects the circumstances behind that. I've heard about public-private enterprise. I've heard about this funding for climate change and funding involving the private sector. Sure, of course, you can't expect only funding and only controls to come from government. We need the help of stakeholders, and one important stakeholder is from the private sector. I heard about fuel subsidies in Indonesia. That relates to pricing, and that is very topical now, of how do you actually dismantle that fuel subsidies in such a way that it is acceptable to society. I've heard about the switch from fossil fuels to green fuels, and the rise and the importance of infrastructure development, and the importance of inclusive growth. All this is very important, and as the last speaker said, he ends off with the note about if you have political will, you can do a lot of things. That is true. That is true. But along with that as well, we must take cognizance that every country is unique and face different types of constraints. And it's not a simple matter of getting things done across the board without differentiating the circumstances in each country. But I think there is a great hope. If you recall the ASEAN community coming up in 2015 and the ASEAN agreement on environmental governance, I didn't show you the